Hi, I'm Sandy O'Sullivan. I'm a professor in the Department of Indigenous Studies. I'm a Wiradjuri person, and in Trans Awareness Week, I'll also tell you that I'm a trans non-binary person. All of that actually has a relevance to the ARC Future Fellowship that I'm on at the moment. So I'm an ARC 2020, end of 2020 to beginning of 2025 Future Fellow and a senior, so level 3 Future Fellow. The project that I'm doing is called Saving Lives, Mapping the Influence of Indigenous LGBTQ plus creative artists. And I've just said project, so I think I owe somebody some money because it's not a project, it's a program. The way that the program works is that there are multiple outcomes, outputs as well, but outcomes in this case, that all link together to affect change across the title of the project program. So, as a future fellow, I'm able to do a whole lot of work in this space that includes the kind of standard things that a research project does, but I'm also able to publicly speak about areas that are across the range of what the program is about, which is queer Indigenous art making, queer Indigenous representation, and queer Indigenous ways of presenting in the world. And so that's a pretty big brief. It's made smaller through application and through articulating what the outputs are going to be. Now, they've changed over time and they need to change quite often. You have to certainly deliver the spirit of the work that you intend to do. And what I've typically found over the years that I've gotten ARC funding is that as long as you do what you say you're going to do, you can exceed that, which is, of course, what most of us end up doing. So I wasn't successful the first time that I applied for Future Fellowship. I applied in 2019. Got a lot of feedback that I followed. I think it was pretty sound feedback, actually. Got very high reviews, but still didn't get funded. I think there were also some political reasons for that, but I'll never know. I then got it in 2020. I did the same thing. I followed the feedback that came through, which was mostly the reports were mostly positive. So I think there was only one thing that needed clarification because you can't change your application at that stage, but you can clarify for the assessors. When I received the funding, again, I was at University of the Sunshine Coast at the time, and I made the move to Macquarie within a month of me starting the project. Probably if I had to do it over again, I wouldn't have started it until I got to Macquarie. But having said that, the move was really made seamless by the research area at Macquarie, who are wonderful, and by distinguished Professor Bronwyn Carlson, who leads both the Department of Indigenous Studies and the Centre for Global Indigenous Futures that the project or program is housed within. The fellowship itself is in some ways kind of straightforward. You're going to do what you say you're going to do. But what the university says it's going to provide became kind of complex because I'd been at another institution. And so they had to match that. And in fact, they not only matched it, they really worked through how this could work and still be fair for other people who have future fellowships and also work to the requirements of the project. All the way through, the process has been relatively straightforward, but obviously COVID had an impact on it, not just starting at the end of 2020 as it did, but also the issues with travel and the issues with the work that people were making as well. And so that had an impact on what was possible to do. but there was always the opportunity to articulate that in reports. I think the one really important part of it for me was the kind of connectedness of doing a fellowship and housing it within, which is a bit of an isolating set of ideas that form a fellowship, you know, that say you're a mid-career researcher who is going to create opportunities for whatever community you're working with, in my case, queer Indigenous community, and the politics of that can be complex, but this is about impact and engagement. So from an ARC perspective, it was relatively straightforward how to articulate that. And same with the project. So going back to the community that needed this work made it substantially more powerful. So that in itself wasn't a barrier. The move wasn't a barrier, again, because of the research area at both within the faculty and broadly at Macquarie made this very seamless. But it was still, there was still complexity to it. And, you know, it wasn't, I don't think any time I've ever had an ARC, it's turned out exactly how I imagined it was going to. And I think that's just good research. So there was a lot more involved than I had anticipated, and the costs were probably greater than I anticipated, though it's been within budget. The impact on community has been greater than I anticipated as well. And the impact on the broader community has been greater. So going back to, you know, this issue of applying for funding, I guess as far as the ARC was concerned, I'm a mid-career researcher, but I think it's important for me to say that I've been an academic for, I think I was 28 or 29 years into being an academic when I got the funding several years ago, now 32 years into it. And so I'm not what most people would think of as mid-career. I'm in my late 50s. But they're working from the end of my PhD. I work in a field where terminal degrees were largely masters at the time that I was working in them, in the 90s and early 2000s. And so I completed mine within a 10-year period of receiving the Future Fellowship, sorry, not 10 years, I've just said 10, 15 years. And so it worked for me in terms of the deadlines, but I probably wouldn't have been able to extend it beyond that. Now, I'd worked as the director of a centre for that focused on research funding coming in and on the dissemination to broader communities, particularly Indigenous communities, for about 10 years. And I'd had more than $50 million funding, as well as ongoing funding in that role that had come through as ARC, NHMRC, and other direct funding from government, as well as a lot of other private entities. And so I was very familiar with how to put a funding application together. I'd had a number of ARCs myself, linkages, discoveries, and LEAF grants. And so I knew what was involved with doing that. I think probably the crucial thing is, for almost every successful application I've got of an unsuccessful one, I put in a discovery years ago, didn't get it, put it in, the next year got it. I do listen to feedback on it, even though I think there were some political issues really to do with the naming of it. You probably note that it's LGBTIQ plus creative artist. The year before it was queer. I think politically that was a bit of a problem, and I adjusted it. It doesn't mean that the language is adjusted in the application or anything actually changes in the application, but it does recognise that it was a quite conservative government, and that it needed that adjustment to be able to get up. So that happened. Areas like the change in field of research codes have been a major issue. Now we've now got a 4.5 code that you may know, if you know anything about Indigenous studies, encompasses about 300 different 6-digit codes. So the 4.5 is the sort of broadly Indigenous studies code. It covers off on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, International Indigenous, Maori, Pacifica. So it's got a range of different codes across different communities, but over 300 compared to the previous iterations of field of research codes, a smattering and not in the right areas. So, for instance, for a really long time, we pitched under 2001, which was, or 200201, sorry, which was cultural studies. So you'll find there was at one stage a huge leap in the amount of people doing cultural studies. It was actually Indigenous studies listed under that for quite a few years. So I imagine there's been a drop in cultural studies, but you know, that has this massive impact on how we locate our work, who's reading it. So field of research codes matters because we know that that's who's going to be doing the first round of reading, and especially in the interdisciplinary space. So I work across the 4.5 code, the Indigenous Studies code, but I'm also across the 4.4 code, which is gender studies or includes gender studies. So as a result, I have to know that I'm writing to quite different groups of people who have different ways of reading this material. And all of us who do interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary work know that that's going to be the case. So I'd strongly suggest that if you can, to understand a little bit about those field of research codes, who's likely to be assessing. I know it's not popular to say it, but use the do not assess function if somebody is a problem person for you. There needs to be some clarity around that, and the ARC haven't provided it yet. So what I will say is that with the best of intentions, you can put in a great application and still not get it up. But I knew out of the application that I did that even if it didn't get up, I'd be doing some of that work. And I think that's the measure of a good, strong application, is knowing that this is important work that needs to happen, whether it's funded or not. So I don't have much more else to say except we're all in a community together, and if there's any way that I can help by having a conversation about this, reading anything in your application if needed, but also having conversations about the financial area of your application is an incredibly important thing to do, to, you know, to trust people. We've got some remarkable people who work in the research area at Macquarie who can support that and help with that. So, but sometimes it does take having those discussions, and we know that there's some gameplay that is required when putting in ARCs. I think anyone who's there in the room knows that, and part of that can be about the financials on it, and so you need to think about what they will fund, what they see as something that's unfundable. And importantly, this issue of impact and engagement, it matters for us as Indigenous people that impact and engagement is central if we're doing work for and with and on behalf of sometimes Indigenous people. We've got to make sure that that they hear about it, that they have feedback into it, that if it's unpopular, that they have a voice in that. And that it's not just us, whoever us is, in my case, a Wiradjuri person who is just one Indigenous person. The way to kind of manage that, of course, is to have groups of people that we work with. That is engagement. The impact effect is something that is often not understood. A lot of applications that I read talk about outputs as though that's enough, but don't measure or understand how they'd measure the impact of the work that they're doing. We need to have that. It's essential to be able to understand whether it's worth funding. And I'm sure whatever project you're doing is worth funding. So how do you evaluate that? How do you understand the change in that? So for me, there's several ways that I've evaluated the impact. And they're not the things that I wrote in the original application, but they reference it sufficiently that it's not inaccurate. And probably the most important one for me is the amount of parents who've come up to me and told me that the work that we're doing and that we've made available has saved the lives of their kids. That's a really big one. Do I want to write that in a report? I mean, yeah, sure, absolutely. But, you know, is that only there to write in a report? No, it's the work that we do should be changing lives. And in my case, in a project that's called Saving Lives, it should be doing that. So thanks.